You guys just speak to them in the office there.
I did, but Rebecca says she never gets cold, so she can't understand it.
Okay. I guess it's 11:50, so we'll start. Do you want to tell them that we're going to start? I think the Zoom they set up, but it's 11:50. I like to start on time. Yeah, there are. Okay. So I think it's recording. Is it? Can you tell?
I don't know. Oh, yeah, they're recording the bottom.
It says live Facebook.
Yeah, but I don't know if it says. Do you want to tell?
I don't want to touch it.
No, it says recording.
Okay, good. Okay, so I know that last week we spoke about, did Cain know that murder was wrong? And I'm not necessarily sure that everybody agreed with my reading. Today's lesson is much less charged and more of an intellectual question. Rather, I don't think there's necessarily an emotional side there. Now, I do want to begin with some background. I took out some Tanachim. If you would like to follow along, if not, you do have some of the sources. I did bring you some of the sources on the source sheet. So to remind you, are we good? Are we taping and everybody's there?
Thank you.
It's good to get.
Yes, we're taping and we're live.
I want to just thank Dr. Chana Tannenbaum for being here today, coming all the way from Nofay Alon. We really appreciate it. It gives us a lot of chizuk, seeing people,
It's good for
right?
me too.
And let me give you a hug.
Thank you.
Good to see you and appreciate you teaching at this time.
Yes,
And I wanted everybody on Zoom to see, we can almost make a Shechianu. Tammy made us this beautiful roll-up, which is very appropriate for our times. Am Yisrael Chai. Hashem. I want to remind everyone to please sign up for Chana's course, and you will get in your Ezor Ishi the proper link, and we'd love to see everyone. Thank you, Chana.
So if we start now, let's talk about Shmuel Aleph. So Shmuel Aleph Perek Tedvav is the story of Shaul, where he is supposed to kill out all of Amalek, and he does not. And remember, at the end of that chapter, which you have here in source number 1, which is going to be an important source for us later on, Shmuel says to him, remember, as he's leaving, somebody tears somebody else's coat. It's not relevant now who tears whose coat, but after the coat is torn, Vayomer lav Shmuel, Kara Hashem et Malchut Yisrael me'alecha hayom, v'netna l'reacha hatov mimeka. So King Saul gets the message that the kingdom is going to be taken away from him. That's chapter 15. Chapter 16 begins with Hashem sending Shmuel out in order to appoint King David. And Hashem sends him to the house of Yishai, and he gets to the house of Yishai, and the first thing he meets, remember, this is a very famous story, he looks at the oldest son and he decides that he's going to appoint the oldest son, and God says to him, don't be taken in by the looks, and he goes to the first son, the second son, the third son, and all of them, Shmuel says, no, this is not the son. And then in Pasuk 11, Shmuel says to Yishai, Hatamu hanearim, what, you have no more sons? Vayama od shar katan. He says, yes, there's one more young man. Does anybody know how old David is at this time? He's 28. Yeah, he's 28. So although like enough to have a picture, he is not so young. And what does he do? This is significant. V'hinei ro'eh batson. He is a shepherd. Vayom Shmuel Yishai shilcha v'tachenu ki lo nasav abo. He says, bring him here because he's obviously the one who's been chosen. And indeed, he comes and Shmuel anoints David. Now, who knows about this anointing? The immediate family of Yishai, and then the chapter continues, and the chapter tells us in Pasuk Yudalet ורוח השם שרה מעם שאול, ובעתיתו רוח רעה מאת השם. We understand that this ruach ra'ah begins to fall on Shaul. ויאמר די שאול אליו, הננה רוח אלוקים רעה מבעתך, יאמר נא אדוננו עבדך לפניך. His servant said to him, listen, we don't want to overstep our boundaries, but יבקשו איש יודע מנגן בכינור. He said, why don't you get a musician? והיה ביות לך רוח אלוקים רעה ונגן בידו וטוב לך. He says, and when you start getting depressed, why don't you bring in this musician? So Shaul likes this idea, pasuk Yud Zayin. ויאמר שאול לעבדיו, ראו נא לי איש מיטיב לנגן בעושה מלאי. Good idea, go find somebody. וילך הנערים, ויאמר, הנה ראיתי בן לישי בית הלחמי. And one of the servants says, you know what? I once saw one of Yishai's sons, Yodea Nagain, he knows how to play. And by the way, V'gibo Chaya v'yish milchama, he's also a man of war. V'navon hadavar v'ish to'ar v'Hashem imo. And he is intelligent and God is with him. Now this becomes the key pasuk. Perek Shmuel Aleph, Perek Tet Zayin, pasuk Yutet. Vayishlach Shaul melachim el Yishai. And Shaul then sends messengers to Yishai. Vayomer Shilcha elai et David bincha asher batzon. Send me your shepherd, David. King sends, what are you going to do? Vayikach Yishai chamor lechem v'no ad yayin v'gdi izim echad v'shlach b'yad David v'no el Shaul. So immediately Yishai packs him up and sends him off to the king. Vayavo David el Shaul vayamod lefanav. And so David comes to serve the king. Vayehevehu me'od. Shaul loves David a lot. Vayhilo nosei kelim. And he also became his weapons carrier. Vayishlach Shaul el Yishai. And he sends a second message to Yishai saying, Ya'mod na David lefanai ki matzachen be'enai. He says, let David, stay here because I like him. V'haya biyoto ruach halukim el Shaul. And then when this bad ruach ra'ah falls on Shaul, v'lakach David et hakinor v'nigen biyido v'ruach v'revach la Shaul v'tov lo v'sara me'elav ruach hara'ah. Okay, now based on Perek Tetvav, at the end of Perek Tetvav, where is David? Where is he? At the end of the chapter we just read, where is he?
Shaul's palace.
With Shaul. In Shaul's palace, or wherever Shaul happens to be. Does Yishai knows about it, David knows about it, Shaul knows David, everything is fine. Okay, now we come into Pasuk Perek Yud Zayin. Perek Yud Zayin, and it's a very long perek, so we're not going to read it all, but let's just review what happens. The Plishtim have gathered in over there by Tel Azekah, by Beit Shemesh today, and they decide that it's a shame that we should have a war where so many people get killed. We are going to send one warrior. You are going to send another warrior. These two people will fight battle, and whoever wins, the other side will become their servants. Okay? Makes sense. So who do the Plishtim send up as their warrior? Well-known warrior. They send out Goliath. Now, if Goliath is the biggest Philistine, based on what you know, who should be the Israelite who comes out to fight the tallest Philistine? The tallest.
Who is never as tall as.
That's right. He's never as tall, but the tall. Correct. But we have, who is the tallest Israelite? Who is head and shoulders taller than everybody else? King Saul. So technically, he should be the one to come out to fight Goliath. He does not. And Goliath, as the Psukim describe, 40 days, 40 nights, he comes out and he curses God and the people. And now we begin Pasuk Yud Bet. David ben Ish Ephrati haya ze mibeit Lechem Yehuda ushmo Yishai v'lo shmona banim. The Navi now introduces us to David, who lives in Beit Lechem, whose father's name is Yishai, who has 8 sons. Now this is an important sentence. Vayish b'mei Shaul zakein baba anashim. If David is the youngest of 8 children, at this point in time, Yishai is a rather older fellow. Vayalchu shloshet b'nei Yishai hagdolim, the 3 oldest sons get drafted into war. V'alchu acharei Shaul lemilchama. V'shem shloshet banav asher halchu lebamilchama, Eliav habachor, Avinadav, and Shama. Those are the 3 of the 8 who have been drafted into war. The David hu hakatan, and David's the youngest. The shlosha hagadim halchu acharei Shaul, but the 3 bigger ones are at war. The David holech v'shov me'al Shaul l'rod et son aviv beit lechem. Now it seems to be this pasuk tells us that David is sort of splitting his time between working for Shaul and shepherding for his father. And this Plishti is busy coming out 40 days and 40 nights. Pasuk Yud Zayin. Vayomi Yishai leDavid beno. And Yishai says to David his son, Kach na lachecha, efat kali hazeh, v'asara lechem hazeh, v'haretz machana lachicha. He says to his sons, see, some things never change. Take this food out to your sons who are soldiers in the field. And also, don't even forget to give to the mifaked. He also needs that achicha tifkod l'shalom, and check out how your brothers are doing. Ve'et arbatam tikach. V'shaul v'heimar v'chol and she'israel be'ema ke'ela nilchamim im plishtim. Okay, so David gets up and he goes down as his father has commanded him, and he comes out to the war. And all of a sudden, he shows up and he hears Goliath, cursing out the people. And all the people are just afraid and they're not doing anything. So David turns to his brothers and he says to them, what's going on here? What is this situation? And they say to him, well, this guy keeps getting up and he's cursing us out. And by the way, the king also promised that whoever beats the giant is going to marry his daughter. And Pasuk Chavchet, Eliav, who is the oldest brother, hears David finding out the information, and he says to him, Lama ze yoradata, va'almi natashta matavasam. Like, what are you doing here? Who asked you to leave? In other words, he starts making fun of David. Like, what are you doing here? Go back to where you belong. Go back to being shepherding.
At 28, you think David is at the height of his strength, and the other brothers should be much older.
That's right, and more mature. And the brothers have seen him appointed king. Who talks to him that way?
I mean, the brothers are older than they may be posh. They should be the ones fighting. The younger brothers,
right? Interesting idea. And David says, like, why are you, talking to me that way? And then, of course, we know that David then comes to Shaul in Pasuk 34, and he says to him, and I think these are the Pasukim I already brought you here in source number 3. Vayomer David al Shaul, Al yipol lev adam alav techayelchem v'nilchamim haplishti hazeh. I will do it. And Shaul says to him, Lo tuchal lelechad al haplishti hazeh. He says, you can't go fight with the Plishti. Lilachem el kinar ata. You're a young man. V'hu ish milchama min ha'arav. But he is a professional warrior. Vayomer David el Shaul, ro'eh haya avdechal la'aviv batzom, uba ha'ariv et hadov v'nasas seh va'eder. He says, no, even though I'm a shepherd, I have experience. I saved them from the lion and I saved them from the bear. And then, of course, Shaul tries to put his armor on David. And of course, we already pointed out that Shaul was so tall, the armor isn't appropriate for David. David says to him, I don't need your armor. And then, of course, David takes the rocks and he announces to the Plishti, you are cursing out, but I am coming in God's name. And David shows a tremendous amount of bitachon. And the Plishti says, I can't even believe, look at Pasuk Mem Gimel, who is this? What do you think? I'm a Kelev that you come to me with like rocks? And he curses David. And David says to the Plishti in Memhei, Ataba elai b'cheruv u'b'chanit u'b'chidon. You are coming to fight me with your sword. V'anochi ba elecha b'shem Hashem tzvaot. But I am coming to fight you in God's name. Elohei Marech Yisrael asher harafta. And I am coming to defend God's answer, God's honor. And then, of course, you know the story. He takes the rock, He throws it, he hits the Plishti on the head, the Plishti falls down. David then goes and takes the sword and cuts off his head. And now let's begin in the end of source 3, at the beginning of page 2, Pasuk Nun Hey. V'chros Shaul et David, v'kirot Shaul et David, yotzei likrat ha'Plishti. And when Shaul sees this interaction, Omer Avner Tsar Hatzava, he says to Avner, the general, Ben Mizeh Hana'ar, who is that lad? Avner, Vayomer Avner, Chei nafshecha hamelech in yadati. He says, I don't know. Vayomer Melech, Sha'al ata ben mizeh ha'elem. He says, well, go find out who is that boy. Ukishuv David me'akot et ha'Plishti. And so when David comes back from killing the Plishti, vayikach oto Avner, so Avner takes him, vayaviu lifnei Shaul, and he brings him before Shaul, v'rosh ha'Plishti biyado, and he's holding Goliath's head in his hand. Vayomer elav Shaul, and Shaul says to him, Ben mi atahanar, whose son are you? Vayomer David, Ben Avdecha Yishai Beit Halachmi. I am the son of Yishai from Beit Lechem. Now, what
excuse me,
obvious problem with chapter 17?
He should know who David is.
Okay,
And he loved him before.
correct. In chapter 16, he loves David. David is in his palace. In chapter 17, David is back home. His father is sending him to Shaul. He goes to war, and Shaul says, who is that? He's ghosting him, right? That's what we call it today. So that is our question today. Our question today is it possible that Shaul, remember our concept this year is, does he know? So here our question is, does Shaul know who David is? And if not, how do we understand this question? So we're going to be offering a number of different suggestions, and we are going to evaluate those suggestions as well. So we're going to begin with Rashi. Rashi, on source number 4, says to us, whose son is this youth? Now, notice Rashi's picking up on a very important thing. He's not asking for David's name here. What is he asking for?
His father.
What is his heritage? You see that? And you'll notice, by the way, that David, though, in 16, he did send to Yishai. Okay, so which means he does know who Yishai is. Now, also, by the way, does David seem surprised by the question? Like he should have looked at, technically, he should have looked at Shaul and he should have said to him,
Don't
you know me, it's
No.
me, right?
Yeah.
But he answers very respectfully. So let's see what Rashi says in source 4. Whose son is this youth? Our rabbi said, did he not recognize him? Is it not stated in chapter 16? And he became his weapon bearer? But rather, this is the explanation. He saw him behaving, i.e., Shaul saw David behaving in a kingly manner. Said Shaul, if he comes from the family of Peretz, he will be a king, for a king may break fences from the word Peretz, lifrots, to make a way for himself, and no one may stop him. If, however, he comes from the family of Zerach, he will merely be an esteemed person. Said Doeg to him, before you ask whether he's from a family of Peretz or Zerach, ask if he descended from a family which qualifies him for the throne. Ask whether or not he's qualified to even enter the congregation, since he is a descendant of Ruth the Moabite. Said Avner to him, we've learned an Ammonite below Ammonite, Moavi below Ammonite. Doeg said, if that's true, a mamzer, we should have the same idea. It should be a mamzer, not a mamzeres. He replied, it's stated because they did not meet you with bread and water, and it is not customary for women to do so. He said to him, men should have met the men, women should have met the women. Avner became silent. Okay, let's understand the Rashi. Rashi is saying exactly the words you used before, that Rashi says that what he's trying to find out, he knows that he's Yishai's son, he knows he's from Beit Lechem, but Shevet Yehuda Yehuda had 2 sons with Tamar. Those 2 sons are Peretz and Zerach. Peretz, those who come out of Peretz, are the kingly line. The Zerach line are just the important people. So when he asks, whose son is he? He's essentially asking, according to Rashi, which branch of the family tree is he? Is he from, and if he's from Peretz, because remember I showed you in source number 1, it's source number 1, Shaul already knows that there's somebody who's going to be king. So he's sort of on that lookout for that personality. So when he sees David taking charge and being successful, he right away says to himself, maybe this is him, and he's asking for his identity. And then Rashi throws in a whole different discussion. Rashi says that at that same time, Doeg, who we know from many different stories, who's a bit of a troublemaker, Doeg says to King Saul at this point in time, why are you even asking whether he's from Peretz or Zerach? That's irrelevant. This man can't even marry into the Jewish people, let alone be king. So in other words, we see that Doeg is sort of mitigating his power, and he's saying he can't even marry a Jew, which, by the way, we see that even at this time of history, the idea of Ammoni velo Ammonit, Moavi velo Moavit is still a hot button topic. And by the way, if you look in source number 5 is the Gemara in Yevamot. And the Gemara in Yevamot, you will see, is almost identical to what Rashi says. The Gemara says, from where are these matters derived? That the female Ammonite and Moavites are permitted. That's what the Gemara is actually talking about. Rabbi Yonasan said, as the verse says, and when Shaul saw David go forth with the Plishti, he said to Avner the captain, Avner, whose son is this? And Avner says, as your soul lives, I cannot tell you. This verse is puzzling. Did Shaul not recognize him? But isn't it previously written that David was his armor bearer? Rather, it must be that he's asking about David's father. And then I'm not going to read the rest of the Gemara because it's very, very similar to what we just said. But you see here that, so they're not even questioning his, whether he's from Peretz or Zerach. According to the Gemara here in Rashi, they're actually questioning whether the son of Ruth the Moabite can come into Kahal Hashem. So that according to approach number 1, and this, by the way, is the most common approach in Chazal, that he knows. Does he know who David is? Yes. But what he's looking for is he's looking for a little bit more of his lineage to find out if indeed he is the one who is going to question, if the one who's going to take the throne. Are we good with that?
Yes. Is Ezra and Nehemiah,
Right.
which is well after
Correct.
they allowed basically that they can convert.
Okay, so that was a whole different situation and a whole different time. That's correct. And based on the situation at large, we have to do things differently. But here, this is also, by the way, some of you are familiar with that. One of the reasons that Shmuel writes the book of Ruth was in order to give validity to David and his ancestry. Okay, so that's answer number 1. Let's look in source number 6, where we have the Ralbag. The Ralbag says, Ben Mizeh, I'm at the bottom of page 3. Ben Mizeh Hanar Avner. Rabim Yitmahu. Many people wonder, Ben Mihu. How could it possibly be that Shaul does not know who it is? We read in 16 that he specifically sent messengers to Yishai. And here's, we're at the underline. The Ralbag gives a very practical answer. He says a king has hundreds of people who serve him. And it's not necessarily the king's job, in order to keep every single person straight, what's his name and Maybe he, he doesn't necessarily, he might recognize him as being one of his servants, but he doesn't necessarily know who he is.
He loved him. It was like
Yeah.
a little bit more than
Right, so that's the problem. So although the Rabbah makes sense to us, like we hear that, and you know that people who are busy, and listen, also you know as well that there's some people who are very good with faces and names, and some people who just aren't. And when you come in contact with so many people, so on one hand we can say like we buy into that, but on the second hand we all say, but he did have a special relationship with him because it says he loved him. Okay, so that's possibility number 2, I guess. Possibility number 3 that the Bag continues with is, again, you'll notice he doesn't ask David for his name, but he asks David for his heritage. And Ralbag tells us, Lo hayta rak ladat mihu, kedei sheyitbe'er lo me'ezu mishpachahu ki kvar hifticho sheyitein lo bito li'isha. He has just promised to give his daughter to this man in marriage. So the first question you want to know is this an appropriate family for my son to marry into? Which means that, by the way, if we go back to the Rashi now in the Gemara, the answer might be, is this guy inappropriate for my daughter? The answer might be, quite right, questionable. And that's how that whole
discussion.
That's correct. That is correct. And that is exactly what the Gemara says, by the way. The Gemara says that there's some people who made good conditions and people who made bad conditions. And God answered them, God helped them and didn't help them. And it's considered Shaul saying, whoever marries my daughter was not a wise sentence. Okay, so that's answer number 6. So answer number, source number 6, it's answer number 2. Answer number 1 was the Gemara. He knows him, but he wants to find his heritage. Answer number 2 is he just has too many servants to know. And answer number 3 is he really wants to know the heritage because he wants to know if it's appropriate to marry his daughter. Okay, let's move on to source number 7, which is the Malbim, which I found to be a particular favorite of mine. Malbim says, Kirot Shaul ben Mizahanar, Avner Halokim Yoma. Avner says, I don't know. Lasira Pliya el Shaul Shesha'al al Avi David, Ukvar Yadakim ben Yishai. Everybody, they all state the same question. He ate Yofia Ha'ar Ha'eloki Vayivakar Kashachar Orosh el Ish Ruach. After David goes through the experience, all of a sudden, God's Shechina is upon him, va'az yitapech le'ish acher, and he almost becomes a different person. He carried ar panav v'hod v'hadar lefanav. The shine on his face and his countenance looks totally different. V'lo hikiru Shaul ata. I think some of us are more familiar with this from the other side, right? You've seen somebody who lower lane who goes through a tragedy, and all of a sudden you don't necessarily recognize them. Their hair gets gray overnight, their cheeks get sunken in, and you're like, wait a minute, who is that? And so here it's saying, I think it's the flip side of it. David becomes so spiritual and his face becomes so radiating with the Shekhinah of Hashem that Shaul had never seen that before. And he looks at it and he's going, wait, who is that? So does he recognize him? Or is it possible that he recognizes him? He's really asking what's different about him. It's not necessarily clear, but here it helps us to understand that David is something different. And then the Malbim also continues with the idea of the daughter. Mitzudat David tells us, very simply, and I think this is also a good answer. Mi ben mihanar, mipnei haruach hara'a shachach shem aviv. When people have mental illness often affects their ability to, their intellectual processes. And so what the Matzudat David is saying is that the Ruach Ra'ah came upon David and he basically forgot. He was confused. He couldn't focus on who David is, and that is why he forgot. So does he know him? Did he know him? Yes. Does he know him now? No. Let's continue to the Abarbanel, who says something similar. He says it doesn't make sense that he doesn't recognize David. He's actually, as we pointed out, he's not necessarily asking about David, but he's asking about David's father. He wants to know if he grew up in a military family. He sees this guy going out to fight the Plishti with no fear, with no armor. That's why he's asking, like, where did this guy grow up? Was he raised in such an environment where nothing seems to fear him? And then I skip a little bit. And then he brings that midrash that we pointed out already, because he sees the sparks of malchut, because it says, "Vayilba Shaul et David madav, shaya madav Shaul k'midotav shel Shaul." The midrash tells us then when Shaul tried to dress David in his armor, the armor shrank and fit David, even though Shaul was much taller. Then the Abarbanel continues. Now, if Yishai was this real warrior, then Avner, the general, should have recognized him. But the Torah pointed out that Yishai is a much older man. He's an older generation of warriors, and that's why Avner doesn't recognize him. And when David answers, he says, "I'm Ben Yishai. My father is a gibor v'adam nechbad." And now listen to this. V'zehu beit halachmi. Now you're all used to translating beit halachmi as beit lechem. But how else could you look at beit halachmi? What other words do you see there? Lochem, beit lochem. That I come from a house, ki bayit yoreh al malat mishpacha. O yomar sheshu'ul mipnei asukav meruach hara'ah hu shocheach mihu avi David, ki im yot makir oto yot ragil sharet lefanav shachach mihu aviv, ulezeh tereh shelo amar mi zeh ha'elam ela ben mi zeh. He also says again, as we said, he's not asking who he is, but he's asking who his father is. And let's, to end our medieval commentators, we'll end up with source number 10, who is the Mahari Kra, who says he admits defeat when he tries to solve the problem in accordance with the plain sense of the verse. And he says, I am unable to reconcile scripture according to its plain sense. He says, I can find Midrashim, like we saw, but according to Pshat, this is a very difficult problem. Okay, so let's sort of sum up until now the various answers that we've given, and these are all the medieval classical commentators. Does he know David? Many of our commentators say yes, but he's asking to find out if he's from Peretz or Zerach. Is he going to be the king? He wants to find out if it's appropriate for his daughter to marry him. He wants to find out if he is the son of a Gibor Chayil. Those were the people who say yes. Then there's a group who say, does he know who David is at this minute? The answer is no. Why not? Either because there were too many servants, or because he has the Ruach Ra'ah. So those are basically the two different sides. Yes, he knows. No, he doesn't know. Now, if we move into modern scholarship, as you can well imagine, it's always easy to be a modern scholar because you come along and it's very easy to come along and say, obviously, what does the modern scholarship say? If you were a modern scholar, what would you say? You have two verses like this that contradict each other. That there were two different transmissions, and there were two different stories, and some editor came and stuck them together. And that's why they are set up this way. Now, the interesting thing is that Rabbi Liebtag, who is a modern day biblical religious scholar, actually says something similar. Yeah, I was a little bit surprised by that as well, but let me explain why he says it. Look at source number 11. Source number 11 is a pasuk that appears in Divrei Hayamim. In Divrei Hayamim it says, V'divrei David HaMelech HaRishonim v'ha'achronim, all of the history of King David, Hinei ketuvim al Divrei Shmuel HaRoeh. Who wrote the story of Shmuel? Excuse me, who wrote the story of David? The Navi Shmuel. But at a certain point, Shmuel dies. And who takes over? Val Divrei Natan Hanavi. Remember, Natan is the one who yells at him with the story of Bathsheba. Va'al Divrei Gad HaChozeh. So Rabbi Liebtag, based on this pasuk in Divrei Hayamim, and then based on the Gemara in source number 12 in Baba Batra. In Baba Batra, the Gemara, which is listing who wrote all the books, Shmuel wrote his book, i.e. the book of Shmuel, the book of Judges, i.e. the book of Shoftim, and the book of Ruth, which you mentioned earlier. Then the Gemara skips a number of lines, and let's continue on page 5. It is also written in the Breita that Shmuel wrote his own book. The Gemara asked, but isn't it written in Shmuel Aleph, Perek Chavchet, and Shmuel died? So then the Gemara answers, God the seer and Natan the prophet finished it. So what Rabbi Liebtag wants to suggest is that Shmuel wrote the Navi all the way into the end of chapter 16. Why? Because that's the end of the Shaul story, basically. Because the new king has been appointed, we understand that his days are numbered, and that's where Shmuel writes to. The Navi, the next Navi, who is Natan, Natan comes and starts writing in chapter 17. And so he sort of, that's why he gives us again the history of Yishai's family. That's why he gives a little bit about where he's coming from, because this starts the next chapter of the opening of King David, when King David kills the Plishti. So this is I thought this was a very interesting approach, one that would not normally think is not necessarily a Jewish approach, but that is Rabbi Liebtag's approach. And he says this way you really have, and he says actually, you have a number of examples like that. For instance, in this past week's Parsha, at the end of Parshat Noach, it tells us about Terach's death. But Terach isn't dead. Right? When Avram goes on Lech Lecha, Terach is still alive. Why does the Torah do it? Because the Torah finishes this story and then begins the next story. You even have it with Avram. The Torah tells about Avram's death before Avram is really dead. So that's what Rabbi Liebtag is saying. First story was written by Shaul. Shmuel tells us about the story of Shaul and his downfall. The next section starts with the rise of King David and continues further from there, written by two different Nevi'im.
They're still all called in the book of Shmuel. The book of Shmuel continues long past that.
Correct.
And they don't split into the book of Natan and the book of or the book of David or whatever.
Right, but you see, it's very clear based on it's very clear based on the pasuk in Divrei Hayamim and based on the Gemara that we view this book. We discussed this here together, that whole machlokes over who wrote the last 8 psukim of Torah. Right, so there are a whole bunch of questions that appear like that. And so indeed, this is Rabbi Liebtag's opinion. So why are there, does Shaul know David at that point in time? According to Rabbi Liebtag, the answer would be
Yes.
probably not. I think Rabbi Liebtag would suggest not. Okay, but now let's look at source number 13. Source number 13.
Or it's one of those. It looks familiar.
Right, so that would be the Ralbag's answer. He looks familiar, but I can't place him. Now, Robert Alter has a book called The Art of Biblical Narrative. Now, the first thing he says on page 58 is, the most common strategy among scholars is to attribute ostensible duplication in the narrative to a duplication of sources. He quotes now he himself is a biblical scholar, and he says, yeah, it's very easy when you have these two contradictory sources to say that it's a duplication of sources, or to a tapping of different traditions by one source, which amounts to a kind of recurrent stammer in the process of transmission, whether written or oral. So that's the first thing he does, is he brings the common approach. And the next thing he does is he says, but I do not accept that. He says the reason he doesn't accept it is he says, if you are an editor of a book, and the books went through editoring, is that the word? Editing, thank you. If the books go through editing, how in the world would you leave that in one chapter after another? He says you don't even have to be a very good editor to pick up on this. So he is convinced that these two chapters were left in by the editor on purpose. And it takes all the way to page 77 to get his hypothesis. And he says like this, the most plausible hypothesis then is that these intriguing instances of recurrent sequences of narrative. He says one chapter after the other, the same story is told in order to reflect a literary convention that, like other narrative conventions, enable the teller of the tale to orient his listeners, to give them intricate clues as to where the tale was going and how it differed delightfully or ingeniously or profoundly from other similar tales. In other words, Robert Alter says this was done on purpose. And it is a literary technique. And it's a literary technique, biblical narrative. I'm at the last line on source number 13. Biblical narrative, for all of its laconic nature, envisages an extraordinary degree of artistic sophistication, playing with the permutations of a literary code largely unfamiliar to us. He says, for instance, let's assume for a minute that Shaul does not know who David is at all. Would he allow him to go fight, to do the thing that he is supposed to be doing? So he suggests here that this is a literary technique in order to teach us two different perspectives of King David. Shaul meets him in chapter 16. And what role does David play in chapter 16? David is the calming musician. He is the one who helps him on Ruach Ra. And you'll notice, by the way, if you go back to chapter 16, Shaul in that chapter is never called king. Very interesting. In that chapter, it's Shaul the man. Shaul interacts with David and David calms him down. Then we come to chapter 17. How do we meet chapter 17? First of all of a sudden, Shaul again is being called king. And now we're not meeting David as musician. Now we're meeting David as warrior. And we know that David was able to play both of these roles. Let's look at source 14 and source 15.
I don't know, parts on here is not called
right, but at different points throughout the chapter, we do have him called king. You have to, I say, it's a very, very long chapter. Okay, so now, source 14 and source 15. Source 15, you all know source 14. Source 14 is the pasuk. David, remember, wants to build the Beit HaMikdash. And the Navi says to him, fantastic. And then God comes to the Navi in the middle of the night. Vayhi elai dvar Hashem lemor. Dan l'rov shlachta u'milchamot gedolot asita lo tivneh bayit l'shmi ki damim rabim shafachta artza lefanai. David can't build the Beit HaMikdash. Why can't David build the Beit HaMikdash? Because he has shed much blood to the ground. Because he is a warrior, it is inappropriate for him to build the Bayit of Shalom that you're not even allowed to use a metal sword on in order to build. That's one aspect of David. But then in source 15, we have Elu Divrei David ha'achronim Ne'um David ben Yishai Ne'um ha'gever Hukam al Mashiach Elokei Yaakov U'ne'im Zmirot Yisrael. These are the last words of David, the sayings of David ben Yishai, the sayings of the man who was raised up high, anointed by God, and the sweet singer of Israel. And so what Robert Alter is trying to argue here is that the two chapters come along to highlight these two very different aspects of David's personality. And he says the only way to do that is by presenting two parallel stories, two parallel issues. And he says it's not a mistake and it's not an oversight. It is a idea that was put in there in purpose in order for David to have these two almost contradictory personalities. Now, let's continue into source number 16. Source number 16 is something similar to Robert Alter. I don't think it's as satisfying as Robert Alter.
Anna,
Is the answer
am I,
by
can you
Rav
hear
Amnon
me, Hannah?
Bazak. Rav Amnon Bazak is one of the
Wait.
Ramim in Har Etzion.
Excuse me, can you hear me?
Rabbi Bazak presents
Can't hear me.
presents that essentially in the whole book of Shmuel, he says the whole book, not just these two chapters, you almost have two, let me put it like two parallel highways running through the book. And he calls one the negative perspective, and he calls the other one the positive perspective. And for instance, if you look at the very first box, he says in chapter 8, and you can go back and look at this, in chapter 8, the people turn to Shmuel and they ask for a king. And Shmuel is very down on them. Why do they want a king? And aren't I good enough? And asking for a king is a terrible thing. But then, if you go to chapter 9, God says to Shmuel, go appoint Shaul as a king, and his job is going to be to save Israel from the Plishtim. That seems to be a very positive aspect. Then, so that's 8. 8 is negative, 9 is positive. Then he divides chapter 10 into two separate approaches. In 1 to 16, there we get a whole bunch of signs that God is indeed with Shaul. But then, all of a sudden, instead of God being with Shaul, the negative aspect is God like basically let Shaul be picked by a lottery. Then, the next thing that happens is in 11 is Shaul actually leads the people. Remember, Amnon came along and said, let us cut out the eye of the people of Yavesh Gilad. And there God, he allows Shaul to win. And we get a missing account. It's not there. Then you get the results of the war against Amnon, where the people accept Shaul as the king. In source 12, because in chapter 12, because the appointing of the king is a very negative thing, we sort of need a renewal of the monarchy. Then we move to 13 and 14, where we have Shaul losing the kingdom as a result of his failure against the Plishtim. That's it seems to be more of a positive aspect because at least they do win against the Plishtim. And then in 15, it's downhill. In 15, we have the loss of the kingdom because of the war of Amalek. 16 is where we saw that he comes and appoints David. So that's positive kingdom. And 17, the story that we have, is the negative version where Shaul does not live up to his expectations. So what Rabbi Bazak wants to say is that you have it's almost as if he wants to rewrite the book in two different parallel tracks. And so that if you look at 17 as a continuation from chapter 14, i.e. skipping 16, then all of a sudden it makes sense because we don't know who David is. Eliav doesn't know that he's been appointed king. He has to ask, who are you? Because he hasn't met him. Now, although this approach is an interesting one, and according to Rabbi Bazak, he himself says, and if you take this approach, all of your problems disappear. And it's not because it's not a contradiction, because it is I guess it would almost be like almost a different Misora. The problem that I have with this approach is that the book isn't set up that way. And that's why I like
Chapter 16 does exist.
chapter does, and to start saying, well, that you should read the book 13, 14, 16, and then you should start reading the book the other way, I personally have problems with, but I do think it is important to show that, first of all, I think there are a couple of things that we need to show here. The first thing we need to show here is that, yes, there is a problem between chapter 16 and chapter 17. The second thing we need to show is that classical commentators do not shy away from the question. They admit that the question exists, and each one tries to give a response and an answer based on their understanding. And even if we go with the Mahari Kra, is also willing to say, I don't know the answer. Those are our medieval commentators. And then we see modern commentators who also are trying to offer new ideas, new suggestions to deal with this problem, and not necessarily ignoring Bible criticism, but you taking Bible criticism and using them for an orthodox approach to the Mikra. Now, I have time, so I actually want to deal with two final issues here as well. Now, the first one is, if you remember, we talked about Shaul. Shaul doesn't know who David is for all kinds of reasons. But who else doesn't know David in the end of chapter 17? Who else doesn't know David? Avner. Avner says, I don't know. So it's one thing if you say the king has too many people, he has the Ruach Ra'ah. How come Avner doesn't know who David is? So you can go back to that idea that he also doesn't know his lineage, and that's exactly what they're trying to find out. That's 100% a legitimate and acceptable answer. I think another answer is when the king turns to you and the king says, I don't know, then you turn to the king and you say, I also don't know, okay? You gotta be smart here, all right? You don't wanna one-up the king. And so that could it could very well be that Avner knows very well who it is that Avner plays along. Or it could also be that Avner, remember, doesn't know about the nevuah that Shaul got. Shaul got the message that there's going to be a new king who's coming. Avner doesn't know that. So part of Avner's not knowing is he also doesn't recognize the importance of King David. Now, before we go any further, I'm going to be the first to admit that when you have a situation that has lots of different answers, usually that indicates to us that none of them are fabulous. And I think you all get that impression as well, but I do think that we can sort of create perhaps a answer that works for us. Let's look now at one more problem in our chapter that I wasn't sure we were going to get to, but now we have the time for it. If you look at source 19, source 19 is the pasuk that comes right before the pasuk that we're discussing, right? So let's look at it inside. So David goes, he fights with the Plishti, he cuts off the Plishti's head, and Vayishlach, I'm going back a little bit. Vayishlach David at Yado, right? He takes out the rock. You all know the story, right? He throws the rock, it hits him. Vayipol al panav arza, which, by the way, here's just a technical question. If he hits him in the head here, how should he have fallen? He should have fallen backwards. Why does he fall forwards? Side point. Vayachazak David min haplishti bekela ube'even vayachat haplishti vayimitehu. And apparently he's not dead yet, and David comes along and kills him. Abal cherev ein biyad David. David does not have a sword, because remember, he came out to war to bring his brother's food. He was not carrying a weapon. Vayaretz David vayamod al plishti, and David comes and he stands up on the plishti. Vayikach et charbo, and he takes the chlerev of Goliath. Vayishalfa mita'ara, and he was able to pull it out of its sheath. Vayimotetu vayichrat bo et rosh, and he cuts off the head of the plishti. Vayu plishtim kimet giburam vayanasu, and then the plishtim see that their strong man has been killed and they run away. Now remember, what was the agreement? The agreement was whoever wins, the other side was going to stay and be slaves. But the plishtim have no intention of being enslaved.
Some things never change.
Some things never change. Vayakumu and Shem Yisrael v'Yehuda vayirau vayirdefu et haplishtim, and so that the Jews get up and they blow their shofar and they start chasing after the plishtim ad bo'achai gai va'ad sharei Ekron, and they chase them all the way to their capital city. Vayiplu chalalei plishtim baderech sharim va'ad gat va'ad Ekron, and we end up having a whole bunch of dead plishtim all over the place. Vayashuvu b'nei Yisrael midlok acharei plishtim vayashasu et machanehem, and the Jews come back and they take booty, they take spoils from the Plishti camp. Now here's the pasuk you want to zero in on. Vayikach David et Rosh HaPlishti, Vayiviehu Yerushalayim, ve'et kelav sham ba'ohel. He takes the head of Goliath, he brings it to Yerushalayim, and he puts his weapons in his tent. And then the next pasuk was v'charot Shaul et David. Then he says, who is that girl? So what is the obvious problem that we have in verse 54?
Where were his weapons?
So we know that he doesn't have weapons. That's not the problem so much, because part of what the Plishtim did was they did not allow the Jews to make weapons. So there were very few weapons among the Jewish people at that time. The question is not so much where are his weapons, because he used the rock, but what is the question? First of all, it said in 55 that he comes to Shaul and he's holding the head of the Plishti, first of all. And Pasuk 54 tells us that where is he bringing the head? Yerushalayim. What's the problem with that?
Doesn't exist.
Correct. Yerushalayim does not exist yet. Yerushalayim only exists after David is king, and then David comes and captures Yerushalayim. So here we have indeed another problem in our story. So we'll do 18 and then 17. We'll work backwards. 18 is the Radak. The Radak quotes his father, Vadoni Avizal Katav, Hinov Ir HaKohanim China Yerushalayim, Ki Sham Hayta Cherev Plishti Kamoshe Mefurash. What's Radak's answer? In a number of chapters, when David is running to Shaul, he goes to Ir Nova Kohanim and he asks them for food and for a weapon. And the Kohanim say, we don't have any, the only food we have is Lachem HaPanim, and the only weapon we have is the sword of Goliath. So what the Radak's father is saying is if the sword of Goliath is in Nov, then Kanereh, his head must be there too. And why is it called Yerushalayim? Because Yerushalayim is a general term for the spiritual center of the Jewish people, wherever it happens to be at that point in time.
If you say that, gives us a lot of problems with, that if that, you say until Yerushalayim is established.
Right, so it doesn't say that.
Because afterwards, then you can have all sorts of people saying all sorts of things about where maybe Jerusalem's moved and it doesn't have to be there.
But let me show you just to prove that there is some sort of validity to this point. Turn to Shoftim, Perek Aleph Pasuk Chet. And I'm sorry I didn't bring it to you. The book of Shoftim, Perek Aleph Pasuk Chet. Vayilchamu. Everybody needs a chance to find. It's a short passage. Just listen. Vayilchamu b'nei Yehuda b'Yerushalayim. Vayilkedu ota. And Bnei Yehuda, now this is the very beginning of the book of Shoftim. Yehuda goes out and they capture Yerushalayim. They capture the city, and they burn it down. What is Yerushalayim doing at the beginning of this book of Shoftim? So this is the Radak's proof. So the Radak wants to say that there were many cities. I guess it would almost be like, in America, there's cities called Jerusalem. Zion. There are places have Beit Lechem. We have Beit Lechem HaGlali, Beit Lechem Ephrata. So the Radak takes this approach and says that there are many cities called Yerushalayim, especially where the center of Jewish Shekhinah is, and therefore he answers the question this way. You're not so satisfied with that answer, so let's go back to source 17, which is the Malbim at the bottom of page 6. The Malbim at the bottom of page 6 says, Vayiviehu Yerushalayim, Watzalomar Libasof Heviu Yerushalayim. Just like we said before, that the Torah likes to finish the story. Imagine if we left the story like this, and then in the middle of David capturing Yerushalayim, all of a sudden a pasuk appeared and wrote, and David brought the head of Goliath from wherever. So that here, this is just the technique, another literary technique that Torah uses is to finish off the story where it belongs. David, Terach dies, Avram dies, and so here the head eventually makes it to Yerushalayim.
Yes,
That
yes.
is the first approach of the Malbim. Are you happier with that one?
Yeah.
Okay. And then he explains, Ki tchila heviu lifnei Shaul. Because as you pointed out, at the beginning, he brings it first to Shaul. Ve'achar kach, and this is interesting, ve'achar kach sivev imo be'arei Yisrael. And after that, he makes I guess we'd call it a military parade through the different cities of Yisrael. Umisham chazar im Shaul ad Givat Shaul. And then he returns to Givat Shaul, which was the city where David lives. Veheviu liYerushalayim, shahayat samuch l'sham. And just the way today, Givat Shaul is close to Yerushalayim. Apparently in biblical times it was as well. V'hagam sha'az yashav haYevusi b'kerev Yerushalayim, kivar ke'arti zot ki haYevusi yashav b'metzudah, v'hayeretz ma hayta biyad Yisrael. And here the Malbim gives us a third answer. The third approach is one that I think you're familiar with, is that Yerushalayim was always split into the upper city and the lower city. And what the Malbim is saying are the Yevusi lived in the upper city, but the lower city was already in the hands of the Israelites. So that when it says that he brought the head of Goliath to Yerushalayim, it means that he's bringing it to the lower city, which was in the hands of the people. So that our initial reaction is that when we turn to Perek Yud Zayin and we read these psukim, and the obvious question we have to ask is, how can Yerushalayim be there? Did they know? Any of those type of questions. It's not one that should cause us panic. Did we answer that question? Does he know?
Maybe.
Maybe. And so that brings us to our very last question. And that very last question is, and I think this is one we have to ask every single class, and that is, why is the Torah ambiguous? Why leave it open in such a way that it's not clear? Because otherwise we wouldn't have a
We had
class.
nothing to discuss.
We'd have nothing to discuss. Okay, the question also, this is another question, by the way. How many times have you learned this story? How many times have you read this chapter without necessarily investigating this question? So I personally think that if you look at the answers that we gave, I think the answer that best answers this specific question is the Robert Alter. That the Robert Alter writes, because that's his whole thesis. His whole thesis is that this was done on purpose as a literary technique in order to teach us this dualism of the complexity, let's use that word, of the personality of David, which is what we see in the various sources. We have 3 more minutes, so if there's somebody who wants to ask a question here or out in Zoom land. Okay, if there are no questions, and next week we're going to do Parsha. I wasn't going to go, and I realized I have to. It was like, and again, it's going to be something that you've learned 100 times, and you can say, wait a minute, I never thought of that before. So
Am I muted or do you?
see if you can figure out who doesn't know in this coming parsha? And therein lies the question.
Not in Lech Lecha, in one.
In Vayera, correct.
Now I was in class and I'm gonna be even less in class because I'm figuring out which ones I like well enough to continue.
Hannah, can you hear
Thank
me?
you.
No.
Guess she doesn't hear us.
There's nothing you
guess
can do.
not.
They lower the volume of the speakers on purpose